In Parshat Bechukotai, we want to explore the third word in the portion. Our portion, Im Bechukotai Telechu, which is translated literally as, if in my laws you walk. And it is that walking that I'm interested in talking about today. What are the lessons, the spiritual and moral significances of the act of walking? For me and many of us, walking involves a motion in some direction propelled by a side-to-side balancing motion, left, right, right. So I'd like to learn about walking in a similar way, proceeding forward through different topics, and at each stage, we will take two different balancing sides into account. The 4 steps in our journey will be the balance between walking as a metaphor and actual. Physical walking, then the balance between walking as a contrast to stopping, and walking as a contrast to running. Then the balance between walking with God and God walking with us. And finally, the balance between walking to somewhere versus walking for its own sake. At our first step on our walk through walking, let's consider the balance of walking as a spiritual metaphor on one side and walking as a physical action on the other side. Walking as a metaphor is the most straightforward way to understand the verse from our Parsha. This phrase, Im Bechukotai Telechu, if in my laws you walk, is presumably about keeping the laws God has given, following God's laws. The term halakha is often translated as Jewish law, but halakha does not come from the same root as the word for law that appears in our verse, chok. Instead, it's actually the same root as a different word in our verse, the word for walking. Halakha really means an embodied spiritual practice. Halakha is a call to personal and communal movement. In the word halakha, the metaphor of walking is how we name a significant part of Jewish life, identity, and wisdom. On the other side, we can consider walking, the physical act itself. And here, it's important to recognize the different relationships different people have with the physical ability to walk, and what those different experiences mean for how we go through life. For those of us who are privileged to be able to walk safely and easily whenever we like, this is a chance to recognize our privilege and acknowledge all the privileges of access we may not always notice that we have as a result. Kara Leibowitz, a contemporary multiply disabled activist and writer, has published a list of 10 examples of walking privilege all walking people should acknowledge. Here's her list, and you can safely access any and all public transportation. You have more options when it comes to finding housing in your price range. You can enter any bathroom, enter any stall, and reach any fixture. You can visit anyone in their home and can access your own home. You can open any door. That's not a metaphor. Your means of daily mobility isn't touched, manipulated, or leaned on by strangers. You can always go through the same entrance as everyone else. You can quickly and safely get out of the building in an emergency. You can see people who move like you being represented in a positive light in media. And finally, your entire being isn't defined by your means of mobility. The safety of walking is also not to be taken for granted, and in America, racialized people and people of lower socioeconomic status, as well as older people, are at a higher risk of pedestrian injury and fatality. And there's also those of us whose mobility is limited by incarceration. If you do have the ability to walk freely and safely and all the advantages that our society affords you as a result, acknowledging that privilege is, as with any privilege, an important step, but only a first step to push you towards working to make our communities as accessible to, inclusive of, and safe for everyone as they are for you. And for those of us whose mobility is sometimes or always limited, I thank you for your leadership, wisdom, and patience as the rest of us try to keep up with your understanding of what is needed to build an accessible world, to deconstruct and redesign all the ways we have made the world unequally and unjustly inaccessible. For our second stage in our walk, let's balance between one side, walking as a contrast to standing still, and on the other side, walking as a contrast to running. Each of these sides has its own balance. For the first side, walking as opposed to standing still, it's instructive to look at a debate between the great sages Hillel and Shammai about the proper way to recite the Shema. Shammai says that in the evening one must say Shema while reclining, and in the morning one must say the Shema while standing. Because in the words of the Shema itself, it says to recite these words in your lying down and in your getting up. Hillel, on the other hand, says to say the Shema however you are in the moment, or however you normally do, or however you like, because the Shema also says to recite the words in your walking on the road. At the heart of this debate is the question, should you pause and focus to declare your faith, as Shammai teaches, or should you take on your faith while going about your other activities, as Hillel says? What do you think? Which spiritual activities do you find require stillness? Which ones are effective while in motion or while simultaneously doing other activities? And what about the other side, walking as a contrast to running? For that foot, we have a Hasidic word about Rabbi Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev of the 18th century, who it is said once saw a man rushing down the street and asked him where he was running to. "I'm looking for work," replied the man. Rabbi Levi Yitzchak replied, "And what if the work you truly need to be doing is running after you?" This story does not always sit well with those of us who believe in the pressing need to act to repair the world. But it carries an important message precisely because of that discomfort. Our impulse to jump into response as soon as we see a problem to try to fix it, when we do not yet fully understand the situation, can bring us to cause more harm than good. Sometimes, and it can also lead to burnout. In addition to drive, we also need deliberation, modeled by the slow, intentional steps of the sage. The tortoise rather than the hare. In our next step, we have on the one side, walking in the way of God, and on the other, God's promise to walk with us. On the first side, we have again the verse that opens our Parsha, Im Bechukotai Telechu, if you walk in my laws, as well as verses like Deuteronomy 28:9 that say V'halachta b'drachav, walk in God's ways. Rabbi Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, a leader of the Lithuanian Jewry in the 19th century, connects the phrase walk in God's ways with a statement of Abba Shaul in Talmud that says we are to make ourselves similar to God. Specifically, as God is compassionate and merciful, so should we be compassionate and merciful. 10 verses into our portion, God concludes the promise of what will happen if in my laws you walk by saying, V'hit halachti betochechem. I will walk within you, or I will walk among you. What does it mean for God to walk within us or for God to walk among us? What does it feel like when that happens? Rabbi Julia Watts-Belzer, a contemporary professor of Jewish studies and disability studies, writes in her book, Loving Our Own Bones, of an experience she had while hearing a public reading of the vision of Ezekiel on Shavuot. Some context for understanding what Rabbi Belzer says is that she uses a wheelchair to get around. She opens the chapter, let me begin with a story of finding God in my own bones. She gives the context for the reading from Ezekiel and the vision Ezekiel has, and then she describes it. Ezekiel sees his God. He sees God as a radiant fire borne on a vast chariot, lifted up by 4 angelic creatures. The chariot itself is barely described, save for one extraordinary feature, its vast, vibrant wheels. The wheels are what grabbed me when I first heard this passage chanted. The wheels are what opened up my heart. Sitting in synagogue that Shavuot morning, I felt the recognition shiver down my bones. God has wheels. Rabbi Belzer goes on, when I think of God on wheels, I think of the delight I take in my own wheelchair, the satisfaction I find in my own disabled life. My wheels set me free and open up my spirit. I draw a powerful sensual joy in tandem with my chair. The way her tires grip into asphalt or concrete, the way I lean into a curve and flow down a gentle grade, the way I feel the twinned vibration of earth and wheel through the soles of my shoes or the balls of my feet. My sense of spirit is bound up with this bone-deep body knowledge, the way flesh flows into frame, into tire, into air. This is how the holy moves through me in the intricate interplay of muscle and spin, the exhilarating physicality of body and wheel. Rabbi Belzer captures a physical and spiritual sensation of what it's like to recognize God in herself, God's experience in her own experience. The promise in our portion that God will walk within us or among us if we walk with God is an invitation to look for those experiences and those texts that allow us to feel God's deep empathy and identification with our physical, spiritual, human lives. For the last steps in our walk through spiritual and moral significances of walking, let's balance between, on one side, walking with purpose towards a destination, and on the other side, the act of walking itself for its own sake. Walking with purpose is an important concept for activists. Marches, for example, are potent tools for public advocacy and solidarity, and they're also powerful representations of progress. We must hold on to the belief that change and progress are possible, and that we as a society can and are in process of walking from where we are to where we should be, a more caring and moral society. Frederick Douglass, 19th century African-American abolitionist who himself escaped slavery, said that the prayers that were effective for him were when, quote, I prayed with my legs. Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel quoted Douglass when he described his experience marching from Selma to Montgomery with Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Heschel said, I felt my legs were praying. The great narratives we tell ourselves in Judaism are about the Exodus, a walk of liberation, a walk towards freedom. Exile, a painful but necessary walk away from home toward a new reality, and always ultimately the expectation of redemption, the continual promise and requirement to walk toward Mashiach, toward salvation. Our spiritual sense of history is not static, and it's not even cyclical. It is one of deliberate movement toward. And on the other side, we can focus on walking for its own sake. Our great narrative of Exodus and liberation quickly turns into a narrative of wandering. We wandered for 40 years in a wilderness we could have crossed in a matter of days if we had gone the direct route. And many sources in our tradition speak of that time of wandering as a spiritual height for our people. Contemporary scholar Dr. Aviva Zornberg writes in her book, Bewilderments, the Midbar, the wilderness, becomes precious in memory. For the prophets and later the sages, it becomes the place of passionate revelation. Hosea, in particular, will speak of God's yearning for that original wilderness where divine seduction might again take place. The wilderness is the source of Israel's exaltation. When we are in a state of motion that is not for the purpose of reaching any worldly goal, but just for the sake of the motion itself, we have an elevated state of being. In a similar way, many of the discussions that make up the mystical masterpiece, the Zohar, take place on the road, while walking, meandering, just as the discussions do. While many of our explorations into the Torah walk towards some lesson, some particular call to action, this one has been instead about the walk itself, meandering among different possible ways of thinking about walking or walking about thinking. And if we have balanced between two sides or looked in two directions at each step between walking the metaphor and walking the physical act, between walking instead of being still and walking instead of running, between walking with God and God walking with us, and between walking with direction and walking like this without direction for its own sake. Shabbat Shalom.